Margaret spun a sponge in circles on a porcelain plate, lost in thoughts about the future, when a sudden feeling of moisture brought her back to reality. She looked down, confused, and realized with a shock that her water had broken. The plate slipped from her hands, falling into the water with a muffled thud. Alone in the kitchen, with her heart pounding like a wild drum, Margaret knew it was time. Caleb had left months ago, unable to accept the reality of parenthood, leaving her behind, a statue of loneliness amidst the wreckage of a marriage that had been her whole world. Memories of Caleb's sporadic visits, drunk and irrational, echoed like ghosts through the room. "Maggie, can't you see? It's him or me," he had shouted the last time, his eyes blurred with alcohol and anger. "Why can't you do this for us?" Margaret ran her hand over her belly, feeling the initial contractions. "There's no us without him," she whispered into the void, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "I choose my child, Caleb." Caleb's resentment had been a dark shadow in his rare visits, growing steadily until it became a threatening storm on the horizon of their lives. But Margaret had the light of unconditional love for her unborn child to guide her through the darkness. She leaned on the counter, taking deep breaths, trying to calm her mind and body for what lay ahead. She knew the path ahead would be challenging, but she looked to the future with a resolve that had been forged in the crucible of her tribulation. Margaret picked up the phone with hands that trembled only slightly and dialed the taxi number. As she waited for the car to arrive, she allowed herself a moment of vulnerability, letting a tear trickle down her face, not out of fear but out of pride for the unwavering love she felt for her unborn child. "Come on, my little one," she murmured, stroking her belly with one hand while picking up the baby bag with the other. "It's time to show the world the strength we have together." And so, Margaret began the first chapter of a new story, not as an abandoned woman, but as a courageous mother about to embrace her destiny. The full moon rose, a silent sentinel in the night sky, as Margaret, with the maternity bag slung over her shoulder, anxiously waited on the porch of her house. Her heart beat in an irregular rhythm, marking the time until the arrival of the taxi she had called. When the headlights finally cut through the darkness of the night, she took a deep breath, gathering the courage she would need for the hours ahead. "To the hospital, please," she instructed the driver with a voice firmer than she felt. Every bump in the road seemed to echo the contractions that were beginning to intensify, a constant reminder that her baby was on the way. The hospital lobby was bathed in artificial light that seemed to flicker in sync with her growing pain. "Please help me," she pleaded with the first nurse she saw, her hand clutching the baby bag like a protective talisman. "How many minutes apart are the contractions?" the nurse asked, holding a clipboard, her voice a mix of professionalism and concern. "Less than 5, Margaret replied, trying to mask the discomfort that each contraction brought. The nurse finished filling out Margaret's paperwork and quickly settled her into a wheelchair, taking her to the maternity center. The delivery room felt like an altar of expectations and fears, and Margaret, in the center, was both the offering and the priestess. Nurses surrounded her, preparing everything for the arrival of the doctor, who seemed more like a mythical figure than an imminent reality. "Where is he?" Margaret asked, her trembling voice cutting through the sterile air. "Please, I need someone to help me." "He's on his way," one of the nurses reassured her, but minutes passed, and the doctor did not arrive. Margaret's anxiety grew with each moment. She looked at the clock, each tick-tock a hammer in her mind, amplifying the fear and uncertainty. "We're here with you, Margaret," another nurse said, holding her hand. "You're not alone." Margaret closed her eyes, trying to focus on the comforting voices of the nurses, but in her heart, a storm of worry was brewing. The doctor's absence was a heavy void in the room, a ghost dancing just out of reach of the light, and the weight became a tangible adversary, as real as the waves of pain sweeping through her body. The atmosphere of anticipation in the delivery room turned into confusion as the door swung open with a sudden creak. A man entered, his white coat worn carelessly with a crooked collar and sleeves rolled unevenly. His identification badge hung upside down, swaying with every clumsy move he made. Margaret, lying on the hospital bed, watched with wide eyes. "Doctor," she called, her voice trembling with pain and uncertainty. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers, and forced a smile that didn't reach his worried gaze. Yes, sorry about the appearance, long night," he muttered, approaching the instrument table with hands that trembled slightly. Margaret tried to compose herself despite the unease growing within her. "Are you okay, doctor?" she asked, her furrowed brows reflecting the concern she felt. He hesitated, his hands pausing over the stainless steel tray filled with medical instruments. Of course, just a bit tired." "Let's see how you're doing," he replied, his shaky voice revealing more than his words tried to hide. One of the nurses approached, casting a cautious glance at the doctor before turning to Margaret. "Doctor, maybe I can," she began, but he interrupted her with a distracted wave of his hand. "No, I can handle this." "Thank you, nurse," he said. But when he put on a pair of gloves, he chose the wrong sizes, not once but twice. Margaret watched every fiber of her being on alert. The scent that emanated from him was a disconcerting combination of alcohol, sweat, and something sweet she couldn't identify. I read about you, Dr. Clean, right? You have a lot of experience with deliveries, don't you? She asked, her mind spinning as she tried to make sense of the situation before her. He paused, looking at her with an expression she couldn't decipher. Yes, many deliveries, he said quickly, but the insecurity in his voice was palpable. As he approached with gloves finally adjusted, Margaret felt a shiver run down her spine. Something was terribly wrong with the man who was supposed to safely bring her child into the world. The contrast between the unsure doctor in front of her and the confident professional she had expected was glaring. A sense of fear began to settle in her heart as the night progressed. The doctor's behavior deviated further and further from the usual protocol. The head nurse, a middle-aged woman with her hair tightly pulled back, took charge of the situation with apprehensive eyes. She stood by the doctor's side, whispering instructions as if she were talking to a medical student on their first day of internship. "Dr. Clean, you need to check the dilation," she said, her voice a mix of concern and authority. He nodded, but his hands trembled, and he hesitated, looking at Margaret as if he expected her to give directions. "Yes, of course, dilation. I was just checking the breathing," he stammered, avoiding the nurse's penetrating gaze. Margaret, clutching the nurse's hand, looked at the doctor with wide eyes filled with fear. "Please, what's happening?" she pleaded, her voice raised by panic. "Are you really qualified to do this?" The doctor took a step back, shaking his head as if to clear a mental fog. I've done this many times," he murmured, but there was a note of doubt in his voice that couldn't be disguised. The nurse exchanged a glance with her colleague at her side, silent communication passing between them. She then turned to Margaret, her eyes filled with calm determination. "Don't worry, dear. I'm here. We'll do this together," she said, squeezing Margaret's hand in solidarity. It was then that Margaret saw, as the doctor leaned forward and his coat collar shifted, the image of a crucifix tattooed at the base of his neck. Her heart stopped, her blood ran cold. It was identical to what Caleb had, an indelible reminder of the faith he had abandoned along with her. "Caleb," she whispered, her voice almost disappearing into the chaos of the room. But the doctor didn't respond, his head lowered as he followed the nurse's instructions, his posture tense and awkward. Before Margaret could process the terror that the revelation brought, the cry of a newborn filled the room. Her child had been born, and the doctor, the man she now suspected was her disguised husband, was holding the baby in his arms. "Give me my child," she demanded, reaching out her arms. He hesitated, looking at the baby and then at Margaret. "I need to take it for standard procedures," he said, his voice strangely calm now. The delivery room, which was supposed to be a sanctuary of new beginnings, had turned into a stage of nightmares for Margaret. Her worst fears were confirmed when the man pretending to be a doctor turned toward her, his disguise falling along with the hood that covered part of his face, revealing the identity of Caleb, her ex-husband. The shock of recognition was like an ice-cold dagger to her heart. Caleb, holding the newborn in his arms with a possessiveness that defied any mother's rights, locked eyes with Margaret. "He doesn't belong here," he said, his voice trembling with a disturbing conviction. He belongs with me. Margaret felt a wave of panic engulf her. Caleb, please don't do this, she pleaded, trying to sit up, but the weakness of her recently parted body betrayed her, keeping her tethered to the bed like invisible chains. The head nurse, sensing the sudden change in the atmosphere, intervened quickly. Sir, you need to hand the baby over to the neonatology team, she said, her authority unquestionable. But Caleb remained unfazed. I'm doing what needs to be done, he said, and with those words, he turned his back on Margaret and hastily left the room. Margaret knew that the reassuring words from the staff were well-intentioned, but empty. He won't hurt my child, will he? She asked, doubt filling her voice, as a nurse held her hand in comfort. We'll bring your baby back, Margaret. You're safe, and we'll keep your child safe too, the nurse replied firmly. However, Margaret knew she had to act quickly. I need to stop him, she murmured, feeling the sedatives begin to cloud her mind and weigh down her limbs. She tried to focus, to gather the strength she knew she had, the strength that had brought her to this point. Please, she said, looking into the nurse's eyes. I have to see my child. The words were a whisper but carried the weight of a desperate mother's cry. In that moment, Margaret made a silent promise to her child and to herself. She would do everything in her power to protect him, no matter the cost. Lying in the recovery room bed, Margaret felt the haze of sedatives trying to pull her into an abyss of unconsciousness. However, the urgency of a desperate maternal instinct pulsed stronger within her, keeping her mental faculties in a forced vigil. She could hear the footsteps and muffled voices of hospital staff through the veil of semi-sedation. Her eyes remained closed, but beneath her eyelids, they moved frantically, following every sound that could indicate Caleb's presence and then seizing a moment of quietude when the attending nurse stepped away. Confident that Margaret was under the influence of medication, she moved with a determination that defied her weakened body. Margaret slid out of bed, her legs trembling and unsteady, barely able to support her weight. But sheer willpower guided her. She leaned against the wall, whispering to herself, "You have to do this. You have to find him." Every step was a battle, every breath a reminder of the terror that propelled her. Margaret navigated the hospital corridors, a labyrinth of doors and possibilities. The sterile light cast long, cold shadows, but within her burned an unrelenting fire. When she finally spotted Caleb's figure turning a corner, a muffled cry escaped her lips. "Caleb," she called, her voice filled with a mix of anger and pleading. He stopped, looking surprised and cautious as she approached. "Where have you taken our child?" she demanded, her voice a whisper of contained fury. He took a step back, perhaps realizing the unwavering resolve that shone in her eyes, a flame that neither pain nor drugs could extinguish. Margaret stood her ground, her defiant posture despite her body's pleas for rest. She wouldn't allow herself to fall until her child was safely in her arms again. Margaret stared at Caleb, fear and determination fiercely dueling in her chest. The hospital corridors seemed to echo with the sound of her uneven breath and the tense silence that stretched between them. "Caleb, where is our child?" she demanded, her voice trembling with the gravity of the situation. Caleb looked at her, a sinister smile distorting his features. "The end of the child, oh Margaret, you've always been so dramatic," he taunted, his laughter sounding cruel and cold in the sterile hallways. "He is exactly where he should be." Caleb's response pierced Margaret's heart like ice. Her worst fears were not just dark possibilities, but horrifying realities unfolding before her eyes. "You can't mean, you wouldn't do that, Caleb. You wouldn't harm your own child," she whispered, a plea disguised as an affirmation. "I would, and I have what is necessary," Caleb replied, madness gleaming in his eyes. "It's not about causing harm, Margaret. It's about doing what's right." Margaret felt the ground waver beneath her feet, her head spinning with Caleb's venomous words. The hospital around her seemed to blur into a haze, her focus entirely on saving her child's life. "You're not thinking clearly," she said, fighting against the drowsiness threatening to claim her consciousness. "Please, Caleb, for everything we've shared, where have you taken our child?" Caleb shrugged, a casual gesture that was at odds with the gravity of his words. You would never understand, Margaret, and now it's too late for you to do anything." His words were like a sharp knife cutting the last strand of hope she held onto. The reality of the situation struck her with brutal force. Her maternal instinct screamed that time was running out. With the last vestige of her energy, she pushed away the sedative-induced haze, knowing she needed to act quickly. "No, Caleb, not while I still breathe," she murmured, her voice low but filled with an unbreakable promise. With every fiber of her being protesting, she forced herself to continue, driven by the primal need to protect her child at any cost. Margaret struggled against the dense fog that the sedative woven in her mind. Each word was a battle, each thought a Herculean effort. Her tongue felt swollen and heavy, making her attempts to speak almost unintelligible. "Nurse, please," she stammered, her voice barely more than a whisper. The words dragged on, distorted and slow, but laden with the urgency of a mother whose child was in danger. The nurse, a young woman with alert eyes and an attentive posture, approached, sensing the terror that afflicted the new mother. "Ma'am," she asked, leaning in closer, "what are you trying to tell me?" Margaret made a supreme effort, the internal struggle to make herself understood painting her face with agony. "My child," she managed to say. "Morgue." The nurse furrowed her brow, confusion evident on her face. "The morgue," she repeated, uncertain. "Why do you think your baby would be there?" "I don't know," Margaret breathed with difficulty, her chest rising and falling with effort. "Please, check. Caleb. He did something." Concern marked the nurse's features as she processed the muffled words. She studied Margaret's face, searching for truth in the depths of her pleading eyes. "All right," she finally said, a firm decision in her voice. "I'll take you there." With a strength she didn't know she possessed, Margaret attempted to walk, her hands reaching for support. The nurse assisted her, wrapping an arm around her waist and guiding her. Together, they embarked on the slow, faltering journey through the hallways, Margaret leaning on the nurse, each step a protest from her exhausted body. "It will be all right, ma'am," the nurse murmured, more to herself than to Margaret. "We'll find your child." The nurse's determination was a beacon for Margaret, a silent promise that they were not alone in this desperate search. And as they walked together down the corridor toward the morgue, hope and fear danced a tense waltz in Margaret's heart, each beat a step toward the unknown. Margaret and the nurse arrived at the morgue, a place that resonated with the silent echo of mortality. Its cold and unyielding walls, the air carried a chill that seeped into their bones, a sensation Margaret felt in her soul. As they advanced, the nurse, with a trembling key in her hand, opened the heavy door that creaked in protest. Inside the cold chamber, where silence was almost tangible, lay an improvised crib, lonely and out of place among rows of metal drawers. With hesitant but urgency-driven steps, they approached and found the unthinkable. Margaret's baby, wrapped in a thin hospital blanket, his chest rising and falling with the fragile breath of life. "Oh God," the nurse exclaimed, her heart sinking in her chest. "He's here, and he's alive." She carefully lifted the baby, feeling the cold temperature of his skin but also the gentle warmth of his breath. Margaret, on the verge of consciousness, could barely keep her eyes open. But upon hearing the confirmation, a wave of relief washed over her. "My baby," she whispered, reaching out a trembling hand toward her child. The nurse, with an urgency fueled by both anger and compassion, hurried through the hallways toward the emergency room, the baby cradled against her chest. "I will find whoever did this," she vowed through gritted teeth, the promise sounding like a pledge. Meanwhile, Margaret, her strength drained by fear and relief, succumbed to the darkness that called her, fainting on the cold hard floor of the morgue. A passing nurse, alerted by the sound of the fall, rushed to her side. "We need help here," he shouted, kneeling beside her, checking her vital signs, and calling for reinforcements. When Margaret opened her eyes again, the blinding glare of emergency lights greeted her, and a new nurse was by her side. Where is he?" were the first words she managed to form, her voice weak but laden with maternal concern, as another nurse approached carrying in her arms the small bundle of life that was her son. Margaret's anxiety transformed instantly into relief and then ecstasy as she saw the baby's serene face. Is he okay? Margaret asked urgently, extending her trembling arms. He's perfect, the nurse replied with a warm smile, carefully placing the baby in Margaret's arms. The moment her child was placed against her chest, the world around her disappeared. Tears welled up in her eyes as she whispered promises of eternal protection and love. My little miracle, my life. I will always protect you, Margaret vowed, feeling the baby's tiny hand clasp her finger with surprising strength. As Margaret regained her composure, the consequences of Caleb's actions unfolded. The man she had once loved had become unrecognizable, consumed by madness that led him to see his own child as an obstacle to Margaret's love. The hospital security cameras had captured every step of his descent into insanity, and with this evidence, he was apprehended, handcuffed, and taken away, unable to harm Margaret or her child again. Margaret's world had been shaken to its core. But there, holding her child, she felt a renewed strength within her. She and her child would embark on a new chapter of their lives together, a chapter of renewal and resilience. We will overcome this, she whispered to her son, and we will be stronger for it. Margaret's story is a tapestry of bravery and unconditional love, a narrative that challenges us to reflect on the power of motherhood. Her love for her child was a beacon that shone through the darkness of betrayal and fear, guiding her towards safety and hope. Each gaze at her child was a silent promise of better days, each caress a reminder that, in the end, a mother's love is the most powerful force of all. Thank you for joining us today on Deep Stories. Be sure to like and subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on our next video.